And welcome back into Tribal Council Chat. And we're your hosts. As always, I'm Bruce Heller.
Sprint Parnell.
And let's take a seat and get started. So we
I'm
have
gonna
a
dip your torches in and get fire.
there you go. And so I forgot that line. We have a bit of a different show for you guys today. Normally we have two distinct segments. Then our third segment is our game we always play, a line blindside first boot. Today's show is really only two segments. It's our first segment is going to be us each doing player profiles, which I'm sure this isn't the last time we'll do this because this was is going to be fun. And we'll each do one. So it'll kind of be three segments, but they fit into one. And then we'll finish with playing our game as always. So,
It was really fun doing it. And yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to today where Bruce and I are talking about two of our favorite old school players. And we'd love to do it again.
and so we know who the other person is doing, but that's all we know about each other's thing. So go ahead and take it away.
Thanks so much, Bruce. So my player profile for week one, and I'll ask you some questions throughout as we go, is my favorite old schooler of all time, Rudy Boesch.
Nice.
Um, Rudy Rudy's, I'm going to go to a bit of a background before I start into the game because I feel with his character it's really important. Rudy joined the US Navy in April of 1945, just days before the fall of Nazi Germany, and was a career long soldier. He was selected to SEAL Team 2 in 1962, where he served during the Cuban Missile Crisis. At this moment, Rudy, who'd become well known as a survivor player, was also very famous in the military, involving responsibilities that involved taking calls directly from President John F. Kennedy during
Wow.
this period of time.
That's
He
cool.
retired from active service in 1990 after 45 years in the American Armed Forces, and 10 years later would compete on the original season of Survivor. Early on in Rudy's Survivor career, and this is really the first point of discussion I want to have before I continue, he was in trouble. Some of the cast members were targeting him. They saw him as, the old guy on the tribe that everybody wants to get rid of early, and that assuming his military background would bring a negative attitude towards the camp that might be hard to work with. Um, However, he gives, in my opinion, late in episode one of the best confessionals of all time when he gets in front of the camera out in the ocean all by himself and says, "There's more of them than there is of me. I gotta fit in." That's definitely, in my mind, one of the best confessionals of all time. One of the most important to learn, not only in the game of Survivor, but also in the game of life,
Yeah.
and it takes him very deep in the game. So I'm curious, what do you think is the big advantage to Rudy's game in contrast with, say, somebody else that we see early, like Bibi over on the other Pagong Beach, and how they both kind of started in the same place, but it panned out so differently?
Yeah. And so before I dive in, real quick, just want to thank Rudy for his service, even though he's no longer with us. But
Absolutely.
yeah, so you mentioned he was in trouble early. And if I remember right, it was Stacy Stillman leading the charge. It's
He
been a
was,
while
and he
since I've
took three
watched
votes.
Borneo. And then we went into the Tagi's first tribal, I believe. It was going to be one of those two because she wanted him gone. So, and she was gone. She died trying. But you mentioned BB, and Rudy and BB were kind of the two old guys of the season. And that's the difference right there. As you mentioned, Rudy knew he had to fit in. He couldn't just ruffle everyone's feathers and be himself. And he was himself, but he knew he had to try to fit in. And I don't really feel like BB did. We saw him annoying everyone on Pagong early. And so,
Rudy had those moments too where, like we saw quite early, where he would open a can of food, kind of like where BB would wash his t-shirt in the rice pot. But at the end of the day, I think Rudy had the social skills and the life experience to be able to manage that, admit when he made a mistake, move on, and form his way into an alliance, which we're just about to talk about in my next part.
Now, real quick, correcting something I said. I said Stacy went home at Toggy's first tribal. That wasn't true. Toggy went to the first tribal, and Sonia went home. I had Sonia on Pagong in my head for some reason.
Sonia went home. It's going back to the commentary we talked about a couple weeks ago. Richard has a really interesting line in there where he says Rudy took 3 votes at the first tribal, 2 at the second, 1 at the third, and then they forgot about him for the rest of the game.
Yeah, because then the alliance formed, and so
That gives us a good segue to get into his alliance. So at this point, we have an alliance of 4 on Toggy Beach. Rudy, a Navy SEAL and a conservative from Virginia Beach, forms an alliance with Richard Hatch, a corporate trainer and member of the LGBT community from Rhode Island, a 22-year-old whitewater rafting guide in Kelly Wigglesworth from Las Vegas, and a truck driver from Wisconsin, Sue Hawk. None of these people would have ever came together in regular life.
yeah.
It's probably, in my opinion, one of the most random alliances that we'll ever see. But also,
Uh-huh.
I know I'm sorry when we get to Micronesia, you and I can have this debate, but I also think it's the greatest alliance of all time. And the way that these people were all able to see the game and see, okay, we might not have much in common. I think there's a moment in time late at the end of, like, when you're going into the finale and everybody's getting ready to go home and excited to see their family again. And Rudy makes a point, something along the lines of, I'm going to paraphrase him here, I don't have the exact quote, but I'll probably never see these people again, and that's totally fine with me. I don't want it. But at the end, all of them work together so well in the game to go from basically writing the strategy of the greatest social experiment of all time, and not only moving on to the merge or moving on a couple of votes, but taking it all the way to the end. And it only breaks at day 37 when they have no choice but to vote Sue off the island.
Yeah, and you're right. They definitely are in that. I don't know if I could pick just one greatest alliance ever. They're there. You mentioned the Black Widow Brigade from Micronesia. I would throw the I-24, and they're from Cook Islands coming back from down 8-4 or whatever they were down. But such a great alliance, a random mix of people, like you said. And
This might
even
be
though
leading
we,
to a future episode.
yeah, and even at the end, we do kind of see Kelly waver back and forth on whether she wants to be a part of this alliance. Like, it's a great group of people. Like, there's someone to root for in that alliance for any type of fan. Because
Oh
Survivor
yeah.
fans have all different types of players they like to root for. That alliance has something for everyone that you can pick and be like, I like that person. At least one.
Absolutely. And I think I definitely, now that you say that, like that Kelly wavered a bit but ended up sticking with it. I have to make a shout out, even though we're talking about Rudy here, to her strategy. Because if
Uh-huh.
you look at the end, just that little bit of treating people as people and not numbers, Kelly's able to pull the votes from the whole Pagong side, with the exception of Greg.
And almost won. She was one vote shy. She was the only person
Exactly.
from that alliance making friends with Pagong, which kind of gets overlooked. But
Definitely gets overlooked. Okay, so to move on, we now have the final 4. We have Rudy, Rich, Kelly, and Sue all at the end of the game. Sue at this point has now gone, as we just mentioned, and we're in the final 3. All Rudy has to do is the extreme challenge of being a 71-year-old man, outlasting 2 people far younger than him. Rich, who's about just over half his age, Kelly, who's basically a college kid at this time, in holding on to the hands on the herd idol challenge. Richard leaves the game, making a very strategic decision, something I'd love to talk about in a future podcast because I think it's so well calculated, but we won't do that here. Leaving Rudy, the 71-year-old, to fight it out amongst Kelly. And what does he do? Takes his hand off. $1 million mistake in many people's opinion. What do you think on the end of this game? Do you think that if Rudy finds his way to the end, that he probably is our first sole survivor and not Richard or Kelly?
If it's him and Kelly, I don't know. Because, like we said, I mean, touching back on what we said, Richard gets all the credit he deserves for inventing the strategic part of the game and forming that alliance and driving a lot of the votes. Kelly kind of invented the social aspect in a way of relationship building. I still think she gets a lot of the Pagong votes, but Rudy is, I don't know. I feel like Rudy was a bit more likable to the rest of the cast than Rich was.
Definitely agree with you. I think that coming from the perspective of a juror back at that time when nobody really knew what the game was about, Rudy is just that type of player that I think everybody would want to give that
Yeah.
title to,
So like
regardless
Kelly
of what
did,
happened on the island and maybe looking at it in a new school lens that we all have today.
yeah, like Kelly did the relationship building, but Rich still got the votes to win. And if Rich did it, I guarantee you Rudy would have been able to do it. Now, the two men going head to head at Final Two would have been really interesting, but I mean, that Final Three, there's not a bad option for a winner there. I would have been
No,
happy
there's
either
not.
way.
Absolutely. So like we stated, Rudy gets to final immunity but doesn't progress the event to, Kelly selects to sit next to Richard, who would eventually win the game. Rudy casts a vote for Richard at final. He'd return a few years later, playing in Survivor All Stars. Rudy had some memorable moments there, notably fighting with Jerry Manthe over not boiling water and drinking it straight out of the well. Because, as he said, I drank water worse than this in Vietnam, which I mean, respect to him, he absolutely did.
That tribe
However,
as a
in
whole,
challenges, pardon?
that tribe as a whole on All Stars, Saboga was just a fever dream.
However, Rudy would struggle in challenges and end up being voted out second. However, one thing I really did love about his time on the show is when you look within All Stars, is when you look at those 7 seasons. If I was to tell you, pick the two most loyal heroes in the game, who's the names that you're probably going to come up with?
I mean, Rudy's one of them for sure.
And Rupert.
Yeah,
And the fact that they came together on the first day, and even though noticeably like you were sitting there as the audience and seeing Rudy basically dying in that immunity challenge in the episode he goes home and Rupert still won't vote him off was such a great moment because it was like
yeah.
you could see those two were no matter what not going to break their alliance even if the game depended on it.
And Rupert would go on to build a pretty great shelter in that shelter building challenge. Kidding, of course. To those that haven't seen
Oh,
All
that was
Stars,
great.
he dug a bunker on the beach that
Yeah,
got soaked from the waves.
that was one horrible challenge, but I mean, he certainly didn't need it when it came to what's more important, building a shelter or getting an alliance with Rob Amber and Jenna and taking everyone out one by one.
See, I loved the shelter building challenge. I wish that like that was a clever idea. Rupert's bunker was just terrible. And
Yeah.
Jerry even references it on Heroes versus Villains because their shelter wasn't good. She goes, "This isn't the worst shelter ever. I was in that on my last season." Like
Yeah.
Saboga gave us so much great content to laugh at on All Stars.
Oh, did they ever? Those are 2 seasons. All Stars and Heroes versus Villains. We got to talk about in the future.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Um, and then finally, in 2019, Rudy passed away very sadly. He'd receive a tribute on the preceding episode of Survivor Island of the Idols at the end of the show. Following his passing, he'd also received many tributes from his different cast members across all seasons of the show. One I found really interesting that I want to point out is a tweet from Richard Hatch that says, ours was an interesting bond, dear Rudy. You helped us open minds and undermine prejudices. you'll remain loved and a dear friend. And so you'll remain loved and iconic, dear friend. Rest in peace. I really thought that relationship between Rich and Rudy is probably one of the most
Uh-huh.
odd but fascinating that Survivor has produced over the years, and just to see those two from such a different world come to understand each other and not only be allies but then become good friends for the rest of Rudy's life was such
Yep.
a unique experience, and something really that I feel old school Survivor can teach a lot of us in the modern world as we're struggling across society with interacting with people who may share different backgrounds, different lifestyles, different experiences.
Yep. And one of the great duos across 44 seasons. And something else I can't pass up to mention in a Rudy Boesch discussion. A lot of them wouldn't go over well in today's culture, but what a funny confessionalist.
Oh yeah,
Definitely.
definitely one that's worthwhile to go back and watch the first season, almost just for how how many things Rudy will say that are just hilarious at the time.
Definitely a product of its
And
time.
and even now when you look at some modern players, and it's like I was laughing today as I was preparing this and I see a confessional of Rudy talking about being with younger people, and this is actually what I was kind of going to lead into via video. Jeff Probst also spoke at Rudy's funeral and did a video tribute to him.
Oh, that's so cool. I didn't
And
know that.
yeah, I'll send you the link. I watched the whole service online. It was amazing to see.
That's awesome.
Um, but one of the unique things in there was I thought it was so funny looking back on it, especially as a big Michelle fan, that there's a video in there saying of Rudy saying, I'm struggling to be with all these young kids. I don't even know what MTV stands for. And now we're in the period where we have Survivor players going on to MTV and becoming stars on that network.
That's funny. Wow. That's amazing. I love that quote.
Oh, yeah. So that's about what I wrote. Anything you have to say? Any points that you want to discuss before you move on to your pick, which I'm also looking forward, really forward to hearing and discussing?
Not really. You covered it pretty well. So I guess I will dive into my turn now. Um,
Looking
I
forward to it.
so I did mine a little bit differently than Brett did, as he kind of wrote his where there was stops for discussion throughout, and I just kind of wrote my like game recap season summary and then have discussion points after. So time for probably a long monologue, but not too bad. So mine is Todd Herzog, who an old school player, won season 15 Survivor China, which is my favorite season. And so let's get started. As I said, Todd played in Survivor China, starting on the Fei Long tribe, and he formed a day one alliance with one of my two favorite players of all time, Amanda Kimmel. And not soon after, they would bring in Courtney Yates, and the trio would go all the way to Final Three together. Todd was a great strategic player, and even pegged on day one by Jean Robert for giving off a strategic vibe, or however he picked that up on the first day. I have no idea. It's Jean Robert. Who knows? Todd and Amanda would bring in Aaron early on into their group, partially as an ally and also partially as a shield, because Aaron had kind of been deemed tribe leader already. But after Survivor China's tribe swap twist, which, if you haven't seen the season, the swap worked by write down two players from the other team you want to kidnap. And those two players got kidnapped to the other tribe, which I don't know if they saw that coming or not, because a lot of the reward challenges were part of the reward is you bring someone from the other tribe back to your camp for the day until the next challenge. But I digress. So, where was I? I was at the tribe swap. And so those three, Todd, Amanda, and Courtney, would bring Denise and James into their alliance and would vote Sharia out, who was one of the Jean Hus who had been voted over. And those five Fei Longs would dominate the game together. as part of one of the rewards that I mentioned of getting to kidnap someone for a day, they would bring James back in, and Todd and Amanda, unfortunately for them, with former John Who Frosty watching, would find where the hidden immunity idol was. Todd would then give that idol to James, as John Who had previously thrown the previous challenge to take Aaron out to try to even out the numbers a little bit. And he would send James to go get that same idol at the John Who camp, giving him 2. Where was I? Sorry. That Fei Long alliance of Todd, Amanda, Courtney, and James would dominate the game together and would be responsible for the decimation of the John Who tribe. Seeing how dangerous his 2 idols were at that point in the game, Todd and Amanda would team up to and with Courtney, I assume, to engineer a plan to blindside James at Final 7, sending him home with not 1, but 2 idols in his pocket, dubbing him one of the dumbest survivor moves ever at the time. Eric would then take that crown the next season, but I digress.
Just gonna say it wouldn't last long.
Where was I? Sorry. Eric and PG would then go next, leaving the Fei Long alliance together at Final 4, Todd, Amanda, Courtney, Denise. With Amanda winning final immunity, the original trio that had been together all along voted Denise out 3-1 and would finish their journey from the beginning of the game all the way to Final 3. And as I mentioned earlier, Todd was a very strategic player and kind of conniving at times. And he had earned some ire from the jury. So the way I interpret the edit, it seems like it was anyone's game going into Final Tribal. And when we reached Final Tribal, Pete Courtney, plenty of sass, even throwing it back at Jean Robert. Hey, did you win an immunity like I did? Amanda, unfortunately for her and for her fans like me, kind of crumbled a little bit. And then Todd put up what is, in my opinion, still the best Final Tribal performance in the history of the show. And that performance won over the jury, giving him a 4-2-1 win, with Courtney finishing second and Amanda finishing third. And so that's kind of game summary, long monologue there. But my first discussion point is one thing I don't feel like Todd gets enough credit is for the social aspect of his game. Like, he gets credit for being one of the best strategists ever. And a big part of his strategy and his game and why it worked is he knew exactly what needed to be said to each individual person out there and what that person needed to do for his plan to work, which that involves just an incredible social game to know each person that well. And you see all these years later, that was 15. We just finished 44. He's still such good friends with so many people from his season that, I mean, Todd's social game is underrated, honestly.
Absolutely. Now when you make that, it's something like I always say that, in my opinion, the element of survival skills and physical challenges, that's kind of off on its own. But like the best strategic players, thinking of players like Todd, players like Rob, players like Sarah Lucina, you can't have brilliant strategic moves without a social game to back it up, or else people don't want to listen to you.
You can have one without the other. It's called Russell.
Yeah, and then you'll lose. But
Yeah, I mean, you can. You're just lose, but it's possible.
we're talking about in order to be successful. But yes, it is called Russell.
Hmm. But yeah, like, and we see an example of Todd, how well he knows what each person needs to hear at Final Tribal with Jean Robert, because previously in the season, Jean Robert, being who he is, had gone up to Todd and be like, hey, I know you and Amanda are running the show. If I get blindsided, I'm holding that against you, not you and her, just you. And so he gets blindsided, of course, and he doesn't see it coming, of course. And so at Final Tribal, he asked Todd, hey, what happened here? Why should I not hold this against you? And Todd strokes his ego perfectly, telling him that he was becoming the strategic threat and that was taking, Todd says that was taking my job. And then at the reunion, Jeff asked them about it, and Todd admitted he was completely playing him and telling him what he wanted to hear. And you don't have the ability to do that unless you've been building bonds and you know people that well. Like, his strategy is incredible, but he doesn't get enough credit for his social game.
Completely agree. And just to make a point, when you talk about Final Tribal Council here, there's been lots of great Final Tribal Councils. There has not been many revolutionary Final Tribal Councils. I'm going to go out and say, and I've said this on social media many times, Todd's Final is the best there has ever been over 44 seasons, and in my opinion, the best we'll ever see.
Oh, true. Just
I don't think it's possible in this new format of the whole jury trying to sit around and have a group discussion to have anybody have a final tribal council that's anywhere close to that.
yeah. When did the new jury format start? Was that Game Changers?
Game changers, but those it was probably thought up and planned after Korong. Not going to comment on that, but you know my opinions.
I'm trying to think if there's been any standout great final tribals, Game Changers or beyond after that. Nothing's coming to mind immediately.
Yeah, I would say if I had to think of that, like Sarah is probably the best just because she played such a dominant and strategic game and had so many moves to talk
Yeah.
about. But
And I
that's
guess,
probably as close as you can come, and it's not in the conversation of
no.
what someone like Todd was able to do in
And
an earlier format.
I would throw both Dom and Wendell out there because they were both so good. They had to outduel each other. But once it got to Laurel being the tie vote, you knew who was going to win because Wendell had a better relationship with her than Dom did,
Exactly. Yeah.
for sure. And so, let me see. We talked about Final Tribal. We talked about how underrated his social game is. I mean, I can't let his strategy get lost amongst me propping up his underrated social game now because he and Amanda, and they brought Courtney in not long after they formed. They were always a step ahead of everyone else, whoever their opponent was, whether that was Jean Hu, or whether that was trying to blindside James, whether that was dealing with the insanity that must have been being on that island with Jean Robert. But I mean,
There's always one of those characters.
I don't want to be too hard on him. He was like, he's a fun character, but I feel like I'd get annoyed out there playing on an island with him.
At least it was probably better than playing with Debbie.
Hmm. Yeah, or Colton. But
Oh, that would be number one. Colton.
okay, so it's telling me I'm gonna go ahead and transition quickly because it's telling me I have 10 minutes left.
Before we do that, before we do that, I just want to say something quick that's like a fun fact I found out recently. Did you know that Todd had to reject his citizenship in order to claim the $1 million prize? And Todd was actually grew up in my former hometown of Scarborough, Ontario, Canada.
Interesting. That is awesome. I will finish with
He was a dual citizen, so he was allowed to apply for China like long before Canadians could start applying for Island of the Idols,
yeah.
but had to reject his Canadian passport and surrender it in order to claim the prize.
I will finish the Todd segment by saying this. We talked about how great his final tribal was, how underrated his social game was, even I mean, you see even with people that went pre-merge, for example, Leslie, like he knew her and was tight with her like this, and they're still like that today. Combine that with the strategy, and I will say he played one of the best games anyone's ever played in this game.
Sweet. And on that segment, let's move on to Align Blindside First Boot, a Tribal Council Chat Classic.
So for mine, I kind of stuck with my player theme and went with players that were allies of Todd's. And I had three names earlier, and I decided to change the third name to make it more interesting. While I was at work tonight, this thought popped into my head to do this. My original thought was Amanda, Courtney, and James, but my answer personally came to my head immediately, so I decided to throw a curveball. And what I'm gonna say is Amanda, Courtney, and Denise Martin.
Courtney and Denise Martin. That is a great pick. Let's say I would ally with Amanda. I think she's very good at the game. Is a very loyal and smart ally,
Yeah,
but she's also been to two finals and hasn't won. So certainly other players have found success against her.
and not only didn't
Um,
win, but could have won both and lost it at Final Tribal both times.
exactly. She definitely could have won both. Let's blindside Courtney. Courtney is one of those players that I think would greatly contribute to your alliance, but at the same time, not sure I would want to sit against her. Um China's one of those seasons that really anyone could have won, and Todd showed up and took it.
Yeah, like the three of them ran the game together from day one. Todd was probably leading the strategy, but because of that, he had earned ire from the jury. So, and he went out there and he won it.
And then leaves me with first booting Denise. No real reason, just someone had to go here, and I feel that I know a lot more about the two others' games, and that I would have a better, stronger alliance that way.
Yep, that was my answer too.
Nice. Now let me kind of make up one on the fly because you had some of the players that I picked.
Oh no,
Uh, it happens. That's okay.
I'm surprised that hasn't
But
happened yet.
let's go with some other names from China that maybe didn't make it as far. Besides, yeah, let's go with some names from China that didn't make it as far to go all the way to the end. I'm gonna give you the names PG, Frosty, and James.
Okay, so I love all three of them, by the way. With
Fast.
I feel like I'm gonna blindside James. Just he's ginormous and muscly, and when we need firewood, he can just push a tree over. Apparently, that's a thing that happened in Survivor China that kind of gets forgotten about because of how good the season is. But the reason I'm blindsiding him is because he'll help my tribe in challenges and around camp pre-merge. But I'm gonna blindside him around merge boot because I don't want that guy in individual immunity challenges because then I can't win any. As for the other two, gosh, I feel like I would get along really well with both of them, but I'll say first boot Frosty, just because when China was around, he was kind of the younger, more inexperienced at life archetype and align with PG. And I feel like me and PG would get along well together and work really well together. She's fun fact about PG played on seasons with both of my two favorite players of all time. Played with Amanda on China and played with Kelly Wentworth on 31 Second Chances.
Absolutely, very good picks, and I think we agree this time. And when we post this online next week, can't wait to hear what our viewers think.
Yep. Do you have any last words on this episode or on Rudy?
No last words in relation to Survivor, but I think you, as a St. Louis Blues fan, and me as an Ottawa Senators fan, I just want to congratulate any Vegas Golden Knights fans that we have out there watching us.
Yep.
Well deserved, amazing run this year, all the way to the cup.
Ivan Barbashev, Alex Petrangelo getting more Cubs. That's awesome. This was a fun episode.
For most of
Got to learn some things I didn't know about Rudy, discuss his game, got to talk about one of my favorite winners with Todd, who won my favorite
learned a lot
season.
I didn't know about Cuts games, so that was fun. We'll definitely
And
do this again.
like I said, in my opinion, he played one of the best games anyone's ever played. When people talk about the best games, they talk about Rob in 22 and Kim in 24. This deserves to be in that conversation. It doesn't always come to people's mind, but that needs to be there. So
100%.
this was a blast, and we will see you guys next week. Take your torches and head back to camp.
Back to camp.